Hello everyone, my name is Lauren Reynolds. Welcome to the Politismos Museum of Greek History online lecture series, which brings the museum experience into your home. With a 21st century online format, Politismos is proud to give visitors the chance to explore Greek history and culture from the comfort of their computer, tablet, and even their smartphone. For this lecture, you'll be learning from author Timothy Sandefur, Vice President for Litigation at the Goldwater Institute in Phoenix, Arizona. He served 15 years as a litigator at the Pacific Legal Foundation, is the author of 4 influential books, and has written over 45 scholarly articles. The topics of his writing include eminent domain, copyright, slavery in the Civil War, political issues in Shakespeare, and even Star Trek. Here is America's Founding Fathers and the Greeks, Part 1, The Greek Frame, by Timothy Sandefur.
No place in America more perfectly symbolizes the influence of the Greeks on America's founding fathers than the central lawn at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. The lawn is framed on 3 sides by the rotunda, which houses the library of the school like a brain, and the 2 porticos that reach out like arms and originally housed the dormitories. Some students still reside in them today. The architect who designed these buildings was, of course, the university's founder, Thomas Jefferson, who, among his many other accomplishments, was one of America's first architects. The style is Roman and therefore essentially Greek. Jefferson designed the buildings as teaching devices for the university's architecture students. As they walk the lawn, the students can see each classical order of architecture represented: Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and Composite. One reason the university so aptly represents the founders' connections to the Greeks is that they largely saw the Greeks through the Roman lens, not just in architecture, but in thought as well. Jefferson got his classical Greek architecture from Roman models, and it is largely thanks to his efforts that today government buildings are primarily designed in a classical style. It was his copy of the Roman temple known as the Maison Carrée in Nîmes, France, that became the Capitol building for Virginia. He also collaborated with Benjamin Latrobe in designing the first version of the U.S. Capitol building, and even secretly entered a classically inspired design in the competition to design the White House. In all of these, his model was Italian architecture adapted to local needs in various elegant ways. Most notably, both Monticello and the university, though classical in design, are built out of brick made locally from Virginia soil. Jefferson was a state-of-the-art thinker, like his buildings made of Virginian materials. As in their architecture, so in their thought. America's founding fathers looked primarily to the Romans for their political and legal foundations, but what they found there were ideas that largely originated with the Greeks. In some cases, this was because the original writings of, say, Plato and Aristotle were still lost or were obscured by poor translations or by fake books falsely attributed to the ancients during the Revolutionary era. Despite his classical education, which enabled him to read Greek and Latin, as well as Spanish, Italian, French, and Anglo-Saxon, Jefferson was not adept at spotting forgeries. Among his favorite poets was Ossian, purportedly an ancient Anglo-Saxon bard whose work was actually forged by the man who claimed to be his translator. During Jefferson's life, it was fairly well known among educated men that Ossian was a fake, but Jefferson just couldn't bring himself to believe it. As for the ancient Greeks, many of them were known to the founders through the Roman lens as well. They got their Plato and their Aristotle largely through Cicero, for example. And they got their Epicurus largely through Lucretius, as we still do today. And I want to focus on Epicurus and Lucretius because even now, Epicurean ideas are not as instantly recognizable to us as those of Aristotle or Plato. But Epicurus had the strongest influence on Thomas Jefferson. This is less true of his political ideas. Greek politics largely served the founders as models to avoid rather than ideals to imitate. But his ideas about the nature of man and the good life came together in Jefferson's final and proudest achievement. Epicurus was born on Samos in 341 BC. As a young man, he moved to Turkey and then in 306 BC to Athens, where he founded a school known as the Garden of Epicurus, not far from Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum. He was a brilliant and prolific writer. Yet thanks to the war against his ideas that Christians waged during the medieval period, Epicurus has been largely obliterated from our history. Of the 300 or so books that he's said to have written, only 4 letters remain today, in addition to some scattered passages quoted in other books. We also have the writings of some of his followers, most importantly, the incomplete epic poem De Rerum Natura by Lucretius. Lucretius was a Roman who lived between 99 BC and 55 BC. Even his beautiful and intriguing poem was lost to the West for centuries after Rome fell and was not published in English translation until less than a century before Jefferson's birth. Given how little is today remembered about him, one might imagine that Epicurus was a minor figure in the ancient world, but it must be emphasized that he was among the most widely respected thinkers of his time. Schools like monasteries devoted to Epicureanism were found in all of the major cities. His followers wore jewelry with portraits of him or hung his picture in their homes. Epicureanism was not just influential in this sense, but it was, according to Norman Wentworth DeWitt, the first missionary philosophy, the first school of thought that actively sought to convert others to its central tenets. Yet those tenets were not religious. Epicurus was a thoroughly secular philosopher, and we might call him the true founder of secular liberalism. The best elements of his thought, the best known elements of his thought, were his materialism and his hedonism. And it's these ideas that, when Rome fell and mysticism rose in the Western world, made him so controversial that Christians sought to purge him from history. To this day, in fact, the Hebrew word for heresy is apikoros, or Epicurus. Epicurus' primary metaphysical doctrine was atomism. All of reality is made up of tiny atoms, or seeds, which exist in a void, moving at different speeds in different directions. They combine or break apart to form the world that we see. Water atoms and earth atoms mix to make clay, which makes up a pot. Light atoms stream through space and strike our eyes, enabling us to see. This idea was not original to Epicurus. An earlier Greek named Democritus is credited with devising atomism, but with Epicurus it became the foundation for a philosophical school. There is no such thing as a spiritual or magical influence in the world. Everything is material, including the soul, which is nothing but the atoms that move inside of us. These arguments for atomism are ingenious, given that the men who worked these ideas out had none of the sophisticated scientific equipment that we have today. They reached their conclusions purely by deductive reasoning. Even where their arguments are wrong, they're clever and persuasive. For example, when explaining the phenomenon of color, Lucretius tells us that it's the result of atoms of sunlight striking colored objects and knocking off some of their odd atoms, which in turn bounce off and strike the eye, resulting in the sensation of color. This explains why we see no color in the dark, and why a brightly colored object will tend to fade over time, as more and more of its seeds are scattered by the sunlight. This is basically correct. Because all that exists are atoms and void, the gods, although they exist, are themselves physical entities, and they are not capable of miracles. In fact, they don't really involve themselves in human life at all. Epicurus and his followers were not actually atheists, but they believed in what in Jefferson's day would have been called deism. The Epicureans focused their hostility not on the existence of gods, but against religious beliefs that surrounded them. On this subject, they were quite clear. Religious mysticism is a positive evil in the world, the source of anxiety and fear, which can only be dispelled by reason. Lucretius, who begins De Rerum Natura with an invocation to the goddess Venus, explains that his enemy is not the gods, but the superstitions and the threats of priests. Fear of death was a particular malady, because it caused cowardice, despair, superstition, and all other evils. But death, Epicurus said, is nothing to us, because all good and evil consists of sensations, and death is the deprivation of sensation. There's no need to fear death, because once we're dead, we can't feel any pain or terror. Abolishing the fear of death makes the mortality of life enjoyable, he says. Not because it adds to it an infinite span of time, but because it takes away the craving for immortality. There is nothing terrible in life for the man who has truly comprehended that there is nothing terrible in death. Worse than the fear of death is the way in which false beliefs about the gods render us vulnerable to manipulation, fraud, and tyranny. This is particularly important to Lucretius. In the most famous passage of De Rerum Natura, he retells the myth of Agamemnon's killing of his daughter Iphigenia. The god Apollo had demanded her sacrifice as the price of letting the winds blow so that Agamemnon could sail to Troy. As a maiden pure of stain to be impurely slaughtered at the age when she should wed, sorrowful sacrifice slain at her father's hand instead, all of this for fair and favorable winds to sail the fleet along, so potent was religion in persuading to do wrong. The cure for this evil was to sweep away this dread, these shadows of the mind, by observing nature and her laws. In the place of mythology and magic, the Epicureans offered a philosophy of materialism, reason, and scientific inquiry. Not only would this give us better knowledge of the real world and avert the evils of theocratic rule, but it would accord better with our own happiness. A man cannot dispel his fear about the most important matters if he does not know what is the nature of the universe, but suspects the truth of some mythical story, wrote Epicurus, so that without natural science it is not possible to attain our pleasures unalloyed. For Epicurus, the goal of life was happiness, or to be more precise, pleasure. This has come to be called hedonism, but that word is misleading, thanks in large part to the misrepresentations perpetuated by Epicurus's religious enemies. The Epicureans were not indulgent pleasure seekers in the sense of pursuing whatever feels good. Epicurus was quite clear about this. Since pleasure is the first good and natural to us, he said, for this very reason we do not pursue every pleasure, but sometimes we pass over many pleasures when greater discomfort accrues to us as the result of them. And similarly, we think many pains better than pleasure, since a greater pleasure can come to us when we have endured pains for a time. The true Epicurean is carefully indulgent, often abstinent, so as to avoid the hangovers that result from unwise choices. On this, Epicurus differs a little bit from Aristotle, a philosopher who, for the most part, is on the same page as Epicurus. For Aristotle, too, happiness is the good, but where Epicurus saw the goal of virtue as pleasure, for Aristotle, the great-souled man aims toward virtue, and happiness arises as a byproduct of that effort. Just like a plant or an animal that flourishes when it exerts itself to meet its capacities, a human being reaches his end when he strives for virtue by exercising his practical wisdom. Pleasure is not the goal. Full living or self-abundance is the end of human life. Virtuous actions are done for the sake of their nobility, not for the consequent pleasure. This is a subtle difference, but it manifests itself in two ways. In a famous passage in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle depicts the great-souled man, megalosuchos, as being like an artist or an artisan. He will spend his money in large and fitting ways for honor's sake. He will walk but never run. Although not fond of danger, he will face it unstintingly when it comes, knowing that there are conditions on which life is not worth having. He gives generously but is reluctant to receive gifts, and is more reluctant to ask for help. He is dignified but unassuming, candid about what he hates and loves, honest without concern for the opinions of those beneath him. He does not make his life revolve around any other person, and is in general a man of few deeds but great and notable ones. He is a fundamentally self-sufficient man. He is a sort of ideal striver for perfection. Epicurus projects a much less strenuous and aristocratic ideal. His ideal is not greatness, but tranquility, ataraxia, harmony with the world and with the self. This means that happiness is not the pursuit of excellence, but the avoidance of pain. Epicurean man is retiring and calm. He enjoys the study of nature. He relishes nature's bounty, but he doesn't pursue honors or seek great and noble deeds. To reiterate, this does not mean self-indulgence or shyness, let alone cowardice, which is fear and therefore disharmony. He is virtuous in a bourgeois sense rather than in an aristocratic sense. It is not possible to live pleasantly without living prudently, honorably, and justly, says Epicurus, nor again to live a life of prudence, honor, and justice without living pleasantly. Where the Aristotelian great-souled man prizes excellence because it is excellent, Epicurean man prizes happiness and is content to till his own garden, to accept what cannot be changed, and to relish the pleasant experiences of life. This difference affected their political ideas as well. although we must always keep in mind that we have so little of Epicurus's writings and those of his disciples that we can't be certain what they thought when it comes to politics. Neither Aristotle nor Epicurus distinguished sharply between government and society. That distinction was one of the great discoveries of Jefferson's own age. But for Aristotle, political society was a natural outgrowth of man's nature in a hierarchically organized world. He is normally viewed as holding an organic view of politics, associated with the conservatism of Edmund Burke, and thus the polar opposite of Jefferson's own opinions. Political society, in this view, is not an artificial product of conscious deliberation. It arises from natural drives, like the family. Epicurus's followers, on the other hand, offered a sort of social compact theory that harmonizes well with the views of America's founding fathers. According to Lucretius, government is not created by the gods or by nature. It's a human construct. In the beginning, man lived in a savage state without language or civilization, writes Lucretius. They did not know how to treat things with fire, or know about the use of hides, or how to dress in skins despoiled from kills. Eventually, nature gave the tongue its different sounds to say, and with the power of language, mankind made the great discoveries of fire and metalworking and organized hunting. At last, cities and citadels sprang up founded by kings who constructed these defenses for their own protection and divided up among their subjects herds and lots of land. But monarchism had its downside because people soon began to compete for political advantage. And at the apex of their climb, Lucretius writes, often envy would blast them like a thunderbolt to fell them with disdain and hurl them into the pit of hateful hell. These political conflicts then led to social collapse, and mankind was reduced once more to chaos, to the very bottom of the barrel, as each sought power and glory for himself. After many years, mankind, sick to death of spending their lives in violence, learned to create a new and better kind of political society, one that would protect people from danger without leading to constant civil strife. That was the idea of the rule of law. Later, some taught men to establish a constitution, set magistrates in place that people would want to live by laws, because the human race, weary of leading all their days in violence, blood dry from constant clashes, were all the more eager to put by their own will and submit to the rigid rule of law. This is obviously a direct ancestor to the social compact theory that more than 16 centuries later would be articulated by John Locke and the American founding fathers. How can we be sure of the influence here? Well, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Swerve, Stephen Greenblatt tells the dramatic story of how Lucretius's De Rerum Natura was almost entirely lost to history, destroyed and neglected by Christian scholars until January 1417, when a book hunter named Poggio Bracciolini managed to find what may have been the world's only surviving copy in the library of a German monastery. Literary collectors snatched up copies in the decades that followed. One was Niccolo Machiavelli, whose own personal copy, dated 1497, still resides in the Vatican Library today. Another was the French philosopher Pierre Gassendi, whose writings were especially prized by John Locke and Thomas Jefferson. Machiavelli is today best known as the author of The Prince, a short, nasty work of political advice to tyrants on how best to stay in power. He may seem an unlikely figure to place at the beginning of modern political philosophy, but what made his writing unique was his single-minded focus on human, practical concerns. Gods, miracles, the realization of abstract virtues play little role in his politics. His perspective is, so to speak, from the bottom up. He takes a stridently mechanistic view of society in which people and rulers are motivated by self-interest rather than seeking to manifest transcendent principles. At any rate, that was what his English admirer, Francis Bacon, thought. Bacon, who lived from 1561 to 1626, is often overlooked in American political history, but he was one of three men, along with John Locke and Isaac Newton, whom Jefferson most admired. He admired Bacon principally for his scientific work. Bacon is thought of as the father of experimental science. But Bacon was also a great lawyer who tried to codify the laws of England, an effort that Jefferson himself replicated in 1776 when he took on the project of cataloging and revising all of the laws of Virginia. It is Bacon who uttered the famous dictum, "Knowledge is power." We sometimes forget what he meant by this. The medieval era had sought power, focusing on ways to command nature by invoking some special formula that might overpower nature's ordinary behavior. might breach the boundary between the material and the spiritual worlds. Esoteric mysteries could transform lead into gold, and so forth. Against this, Bacon contrasted knowledge, the understanding of nature's laws, which would let man exploit nature's already existing powers, not by reaching into the spiritual realm, but by focusing on this world, with its mechanistic causes and effects. To say that knowledge is power meant that the powers were not esoteric, but real and open to everyone's understanding. That was the potential of science. Bacon was therefore a materialist in the same vein as Lucretius, and he cites Lucretius in his writings. He also cites Machiavelli, praising him for writing what men do and not what they ought to do. Bacon's personal secretary was Thomas Hobbes, who later authored the infamous book Leviathan and is considered by many to be the father of liberal social compact theory. If we're looking for a direct person-to-person transfer of the knowledge of Epicurean philosophy, we have it. Lucretius to Machiavelli, Bacon to Hobbes, which in a sense echoes the earlier intellectual family of ancient Athens, Socrates to Plato to Aristotle to Alexander. But it's not necessary to assume a direct influence. These ideas were circulating among the intellectual elites of Europe. Gassendi, too, was an admirer of Lucretius as well as an acquaintance of Thomas Hobbes, and Locke and Jefferson were enthusiasts for his writing. In any event, it's clear that the rediscovery of Epicureanism in 1417 in the form of De Rerum Natura sparked a tremendous intellectual explosion. It became one of the centerpieces of the Renaissance, and thanks to Bacon and Locke, of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a period in which intellectual leaders devoted themselves to rational scientific investigation and the pursuit of the good life, in especially Epicurean terms. The word enlightenment comes from a philosopher of the period, Immanuel Kant, who defined it as man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. That meant putting away the myths by which mankind had so long lived, whether it be the myth that lightning is the wrath of God, dispelled, of course, by Benjamin Franklin, or the myth of the divine right of kings, dispelled in large part by Jefferson himself. Very often this Enlightenment skepticism clashed with the religious orthodoxy of the time, and just as Epicurus was accused of atheism in his day, so the Enlightenment figures like Thomas Jefferson were also frequently accused of atheism. In reality, Jefferson was not an atheist, but his religious views are close enough to those of Epicurus and Lucretius. He denied the possibility of miracles to such an extent that when he was president, he literally took a penknife to the Bible, cutting out everything he considered unnecessary or forged. The result is a short pamphlet we today call the Jefferson Bible, which includes none of the Old Testament, no virgin birth, and no rising from the dead. Jefferson later said that the task was as easy as picking diamonds from a dunghill. Jefferson even flirted with the idea that the soul itself is purely material, something like magnetism or gravity. I can conceive thought to be an action of a particular organization of matter, he wrote, formed for that purpose by its creator, as well as that attraction and action of matter, as magnetism of the lodestone. Jefferson even argued that people who deny materialism and claim that the soul is an immaterial spirit are the real heretics, because they are actually denying the reality of the soul. To talk of immaterial existences is to talk of nothings, he said. To say that the human soul, angels, God are immaterial is to say that they are nothings, or that there is no God, angels, or soul. This heresy of immaterialism is masked atheism. These arguments parallel those of Epicurus and Lucretius, although, unlike them, Jefferson seems to have believed that the soul was immortal. Lucretius thought that the soul, like everything else, is made of atoms, and when we die, it floats away like smoke. Jefferson considered himself a Christian because he found Jesus' ethical teachings valuable, equal, in fact, to those of Epicurus, but he was a materialist, and he thought that the spiritual and mystical aspects of Christian dogma had been fraudulently attached to Jesus' actual teachings over the centuries. Although Jefferson was careful to keep his views concealed from the public throughout his lifetime, he certainly never told anybody about cutting up the Bible, he was nevertheless accused of atheism and heresy throughout his political career. According to one story, Jefferson was visiting a friend's plantation just outside Washington when the friend's slave accidentally cut himself on the leg with an axe. Jefferson helped to sew up the wound and then commented that it was strange that God would put the fleshy part of the leg on the back instead of on the front, where it might cushion the bone. An anti-Jefferson politician who heard the remark cried, "What is the world coming to? Here is this fellow Jefferson, after turning upside down everything on earth, now quarreling with the Almighty himself." I have said that Epicurus' political ideas were less of an influence on America's founding fathers than his views on the good life. And I want to return to that because there's an important sense in which these two things intersect, and that intersection affects the way we live our lives today. In 1819, Jefferson exchanged letters with William Short, who had been his protege when Jefferson was serving as ambassador to France in the 1780s. Short was now an ailing 60-year-old former ambassador himself. "I feel the effects of advancing age," Short wrote. "I have come to consider repose as the highest good, so that when driven out of this heated brick kiln in the summer, my first aim is to reach the place of repose which can be the soonest and easiest attained. This growing indolence, which I know I am wrong to indulge, but continue to do so, has made me give up by degrees my daily exercise on horseback. I have so far adopted the principles of Epicurus, who, after all, I am inclined to believe was the wisest of all of the ancient philosophers, as he is certainly the least understood and most calumniated among them, as to consult my ease towards the attainment of happiness in this poor world, poor even in making the best of it." To this, Jefferson replied, "As you say of yourself, so I too am an Epicurean. I consider the genuine, not the imputed, doctrines of Epicurus as containing everything rational in moral philosophy which Greece and Rome have left us. The Stoics and Platonists' great crime was their calumnies of Epicurus and their misrepresentations of his doctrines. Epicurus gave laws for governing ourselves, Jesus a supplement of the duties and charities we owe to others." But Jefferson paused to scold his former pupil. "I take the liberty of observing that you are not a true disciple of our master Epicurus in indulging the indolence to which you say you are yielding. One of his canons, you know, was that the indulgence which prevents a greater pleasure or produces a greater pain is to be avoided. Your love of repose will lead in its progress to a suspension of healthy exercise, a relaxation of mind, and an indifference to everything around you, and finally to a debility of the body and habitude of the mind farthest of all things from the happiness which the well-regulated indulgences of Epicurus ensure. Fortitude, as you know, is one of his 4 cardinal virtues. That teaches us to meet and to surmount difficulties, not to fly from them like cowards, and fly too in vain, for difficulties will meet us at every turn of the road." Jefferson was reiterating the point I made earlier about Epicurus' hedonism. The philosopher did not mean that one should indulge in all pleasures or lead a life of indolence, but that the good life was one carefully measured, properly proportioned. It meant the pursuit of knowledge, proper exercise, relishing the goods of life, a life of harmony and fulfillment. It meant, in short, the pursuit of happiness. This phrase, pursuit of happiness, is best known to us from Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, although Jefferson was paraphrasing the words of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, issued a month earlier and written by his friend George Mason. According to Mason's wording, all men are by nature free and independent and have certain inherent rights, which include the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. But, Mason continued, no free government or the blessings of liberty can be preserved to any people but by a firm adherence to justice, moderation, temperance, frugality, and virtue. This wording is profoundly Epicurean. It supposes that the purpose of government is not to make people good or to ensure that they act in compliance with the will of God, but that the state exists to help protect the freedom of people who are pursuing their happiness and seeking the enjoyment of life. This word enjoyment in particular is an especially Epicurean concept. No other philosopher of the classical age emphasized the value of enjoyment as thoroughly as Epicurus. For Aristotle, the goal of life was to flourish, to achieve one's natural end, which will tend to result in a state of joy, but the enjoyment itself is not the purpose of the activity. For the Stoics, the purpose of life was virtue, even, perhaps especially, when that virtue led to hardship. But for the Epicureans, the purpose of life is enjoyment, meaning unimpeded harmony with nature, and an active harmony, not passive indulgence, not relaxation of the mind. If there were any doubt on this head, we can consult John Locke, who first used the phrase pursuit of happiness in his essay concerning human understanding, which was heavily influenced by Gassendi. Locke wrote that the necessity of pursuing happiness is the foundation of liberty. As therefore the highest perfection of intellectual nature lies in a careful and constant pursuit of true and solid happiness, so the care of ourselves, that we mistake not imaginary for real happiness, is the necessary foundation of our liberty. And when the Virginia Declaration of Rights says that a firm adherence to justice, moderation, temperance, frugality, and virtue goes hand in hand with the pursuit of happiness, it echoes Epicurus' warning that it's not possible to live pleasantly without living prudently, honorably, and justly. In short, Epicureans like Locke and Jefferson believe that if our souls are to be rightly ordered, we will pursue pleasure in the right way by exerting ourselves appropriately toward those things that will in fact make us happy, by enabling us to enjoy a harmony with the world, eliminating pain and suffering, and allowing us to relish life. Proportionality, intelligence, proper exercise and nutrition, curiosity, love, reason, friendship, good literature, good wine, good conversation. Incidentally, this last is one of the most charming Greek contributions to civilization. The Greeks were so fond of conversation that they invented the tradition of writing them down. Joyful conversation, exertion through thought and work were essential to Jefferson's way of life. Visitors to Monticello or to the White House during his presidency were often treated to sparkling dinner-time conversation from some of the most brilliant minds America had to offer. Jefferson hosted dinner parties virtually every other day. During just the first year of his presidency, he spent $2,226.33 on wine. Of course, being a true Epicurean, he is never known to have been intoxicated. On any one night, Jefferson, himself an inventor, philosopher, president of the American Philosophical Society, inventor of a new kind of plow, the first archaeologist in America, might have at his table Thomas Paine, the author of The Rights of Man, scientist Joseph Priestley, who discovered oxygen and founded the Unitarian Church, the woman of letters Margaret Bayard Smith, the comedian John Bernard, the poet Joel Barlow, the artist John Trumbull, the explorer John Ledyard, the doctor Benjamin Rush, the young prodigy John Quincy Adams, and many others. Political conversations were avoided at these dinners, so the guests would discuss instead the latest news of the Lewis and Clark expedition, or the best place to view the Potomac at sunset, or how to attract more Italian immigrants to America to ensure that the new nation would have enough musical talent, a particular project of Jefferson's. For Jefferson, an intellectually stimulating conversation around a well-stocked table was the very sweetness of life. During the Revolutionary War, while he was serving as governor of Virginia, Jefferson invited a Hessian military officer, a POW captured by American forces, to dine at Monticello. Discovering that they were both admirers of Ossian, they quoted lines from the poet back and forth until they at last had to pull down a copy to read it out loud. There can be no doubt of Jefferson's passionate attachment to the cause of his country. "I would lend my hand to sink the whole island of Great Britain in the ocean," he said. But for Jefferson, a little thing like war could not be expected to stand in the way of an exciting conversation about books. But the pursuit of happiness, Epicurus believed, was inconsistent with the life of politics. In his view, politics meant conflict, ambition, deceit, frustration, disharmony that at best distracts from the pursuit of happiness. Thus, he and Lucretius were unambiguous in recommending against the politically involved life. This may seem strange, given Jefferson's lifelong participation in politics. He was elected to the Virginia legislature at the age of 26, and with only brief interruptions served in public office for the next 4 decades. But he spent almost all of that time lamenting that he was compelled to serve, and claiming that he yielded to the call only because of the extraordinary urgency of the times. It's easy to dismiss this as mere talk. It was part of the required code of conduct for an 18th century Virginia gentleman to disclaim any desire for public office, and some contemporaries thought it was all just a show. John Adams, for instance, thought that Jefferson was secretly as ambitious as Oliver Cromwell. But however much Jefferson may have taken the opportunity to govern, he appears to have actually wished not to. He genuinely preferred my family, my farm, and my books, and loved more to cultivate his garden and oversee construction at Monticello than to attend political business. He believed strongly in the mission of 1776 and in what he called the Revolution of 1800 when his countrymen chose him over John Adams. He therefore did not shrink from advancing his principles when he had the chance, but he never sought out political arguments, as, for instance, Alexander Hamilton did. Whenever one was unavoidable, he tried to find ways other than direct confrontation, often sending deputies into the fight instead. And this gained him a reputation in some quarters for duplicity or cowardice. but it seems to have really pained him to come into political conflict. He was a practical and extremely successful politician, but his maneuvers to avoid political strife were not just for show. Washington could stare down his political opponents. Adams seems to have enjoyed disapproval. Madison would argue and cajole and even write newspaper editorials, but Jefferson did none of these. He genuinely tried, as he put it in one particularly Epicurean phrase, to take things by the smooth handle. Even in retirement, when he and his former arch nemesis Adams reconciled, he refused to take any of Adams's invitations to political debate. And unlike Washington or Patrick Henry or even Madison, all of whom served in some public capacity after their retirement, Jefferson left the presidency in 1808 and never again left Virginia. He would write to politicians about his ideas and engage in conversations around the Monticello dinner table, but true to his Epicureanism, he never again sought public office. Instead, he devoted the final decade of his life to the most Epicurean project of all, the founding of the University of Virginia. Jefferson's plans for the university were a radical departure from the European tradition. Not only was the architecture based on his distinctive blend of classical and Virginian, but there would be no chapel. In fact, Jefferson at first planned not even to include religion in the curriculum, although this plan proved too controversial. European universities had always been centered around a church, but Jefferson's university would be centered around the library instead. That architecture announced a dramatic new educational plan. The University of Virginia would be the first secular college in the United States and a lighthouse to the Enlightenment. More than that, the university would take a quintessentially Epicurean attitude toward learning. All that is necessary for a student, Jefferson thought, is access to a library and directions in what order the books are to be read. This and free-flowing conversation were the keys to learning. This was a quintessentially Greek attitude. The philosophical dialogues of Plato are where we get the word symposium, after all, and Jefferson attributed his own education less to his formal schooling than to the many hours he spent in the company of his teachers in Williamsburg. Jefferson's original vision for the university was modeled on his conception. There would be no mandated curriculum. Students would choose their own classes through a revolutionary new elective system. Nor would there be degrees in the sense that was common at that time. The institution would only award the title of graduate to students who completed a course of study. It would not be a sort of advanced English boarding school the way Jefferson's own college had been, but would be instead an academical village with learning based on a combination of independent study and conversation. As to discipline, the students would maintain that by themselves through a student-run honor code that would mete out punishment to wrongdoers. And the school would be built around the lawn that echoes the famous Garden of Epicurus, that would, he said, afford quiet retirement to friendly study. We today think of a university as a source of intellectual breakthroughs, a boisterous training ground for the next generation of upwardly mobile entrepreneurs and activists. But Jefferson envisioned his university as a model of learning for a generation of virtuous American farmers, people who would strive for self-sufficiency and tranquility. This ideal was part of what some have called Jefferson's moral agrarianism, an Epicurean notion that to live the good life of harmony and pleasure requires us to interact directly with nature. Though an old man, Jefferson wrote in the years when he was working on the university, "I am a young gardener." The university lawn and the places he planned for the School of Botany and an experimental farm would help connect students to the earth and teach them agrarian virtue. Sadly, Jefferson's original plans clashed with crowds of rowdy students more interested in drinking and carousing than careful study. In 1825, less than a year before his death, the students rioted, and one of the three leaders of the riot was Jefferson's own grandnephew. One of the three leaders, when the university's governing board, which along with Jefferson included James Madison and James Monroe, met to determine how the students would be punished, the elderly Jefferson collapsed in tears. The shock, said Margaret Bayard Smith, was electric. The grandnephew was expelled. Sadly, although the university adopted a more stringent disciplinary system, the situation got worse. Not for another half-century would it gain a respectable academic reputation. But many of Jefferson's innovations did survive. Secularization is the norm in American colleges, and a version of his elective system is now typical. Although universities today award degrees, they're specialized by major in a way that mimics Jefferson's plan. Epicurus's garden outside of Athens had been a famously egalitarian school, open to both sexes, open even to slaves. Jefferson didn't go that far. But considering that universities in Jefferson's era were steeped in rote memorization, dreary traditionalism, mandatory religious observances, and that even Harvard ranked its students by their family's social status instead of scholarly achievement, we can respect how essentially democratic Jefferson's ideas really were. I focused on Thomas Jefferson here, although obviously he was not America's only founding father, and his beliefs on religious and political matters were sometimes unpopular at the time, because he was nevertheless at the intellectual forefront of the American Revolution. His friend Benjamin Rush once remarked that Washington fought for America, but Jefferson and Adams thought for America. Jefferson's life is summed up in that famous phrase carved onto his monument in Washington, "I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility to every form of tyranny over the mind of man." We can judge how well he accomplished that by looking at the 3 achievements carved onto his gravestone that he himself designed. He asked that it list the authorship of the Declaration of Independence, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and the founding of the University of Virginia. Each of these makes good on his belief in freedom in a different way. The Declaration stands for political freedom, the Statute of Religious Freedom for freedom of conscience, and the university represents intellectual freedom. In each way, it demonstrates the commitment to thought and virtue that makes good the debt of America's founding fathers to the philosophers of ancient Greece, in this case, particularly Epicurus. While Jefferson was a leading intellectual, sometimes far ahead of his countrymen, much of his philosophy was shared with millions of Americans who voted for him, admired him, and celebrated his memory after he died. I want to leave you with one example of how pervasive these sentiments really were. Sometime after he became president, Jefferson began putting together a scrapbook of poems that he liked. He would cut them out of newspapers and paste them into the book, which eventually grew to 4 volumes. Now, these poems were written by ordinary Americans, teachers, lawyers, newspaper editorials, others who were not particularly good poets but enjoyed expressing themselves in this way. Even Jefferson himself wrote a few of them. One of these poems was actually an extract from a Renaissance-era poem called Mirror for Magistrates, written by an unknown author. It expresses the connection between virtue and the good life, particularly for political leaders, that was essential to Jefferson's version of Epicureanism. "What doth avail to have a princely place, a name of honor and a high degree, to come by kindred of a noble race, except we princely, worthy, noble be? The fruit declares the goodness of the tree. Do brag no more of birth or lineage then, for virtue, grace, and manners make the man." Beside this poem, Jefferson wrote in pencil, "As good now as when it was written."